Hello, everyone. Welcome. Thank you so much for taking the time to join us for today's webinar, The Secret Sauce, How Red Canary Improves Intelligence and Detection with Synapse. My name is Ryan Hallback, and I'm a Principal Intelligence Analyst at the Vertex Project, and I'm joined here today with Katie Nichols and Kyle Rainey from Red Canary. Katie is the Director of Intelligence Operations at Red Canary, and Kyle is the Senior Intelligence Engineer. Together, they represent a wealth of knowledge and experience in the industry, and it is truly a pleasure to have them here with me today. At Vertex, we commonly get asked how organizations are using Synapse to support their intelligence operations. People want to know what data people are analyzing and where Synapse fits into their overall intelligence pipeline. So today, we're going to pull back the curtain and give you a firsthand account from one of our customers of what it's like to perform analysis in Synapse. We're going to start off by giving you a quick overview of Synapse for those of you who may not be familiar. Katie is then going to follow me with an introduction to Red Canary and explain why they chose Synapse as their intelligence platform, and also give you some background into the use case that you're going to hear from Kyle today. Next, Kyle will walk you through an intelligence use case using some qbot malware activity that they observed in their endpoint telemetry. And then we'll end the webinar with a quick Q&A segment where I'll ask them some questions about their Synapse experience. Before I get started, I want to encourage you to feel free to ask any questions at any point during the webinar directly there in the chat. We have several people on standby that are eager to answer your questions. So without further ado, Synapse is a central intelligence system that we created at Vertex to allow analysts to collaborate and perform holistic data analysis and insight discovery at scale. As an organization, we needed to analyze data as a team. And as analysts, we needed a way to analyze data at the speed of thought and easily record our assessments so that they could be vetted and shared with others. So Synapse was our solution to allow analysts to perform intelligence discovery and analysis at every stage of the intelligence lifecycle using a single platform. It allows you to represent and fuse data from any discipline. So from the threat space, like you'll hear from today from Kyle and Katie, also from the financial discipline and also the business discipline as well. You can use features like our power-ups and Storm query language to easily enrich and manipulate and explore data so that you can quickly gain valuable insights. And then you can use things like tags and other constructs to capture your assessments and share them with analysts directly in the system or other customers. So as you will hear today, Synapse is a powerful tool that you can use to serve as your organization's system of analytical record. Now I'm going to pass it over to Katie so that you can hear from Red Canary and how they use Synapse to support their intelligence needs.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Ryan. Really excited to be here with you all today. As Ryan said, I'm Katie Nichols. I'm the Director of Intelligence Operations at Red Canary. I lead our intel and threat hunting teams. And I'm just going to give you a little bit of background about our team, about how we use Synapse before I pass it to Kyle for the really fun part, the live demo. So a little bit about our team. Red Canary does managed detection and response, and that is where our team focuses, right? We are all about actionable intelligence. If it's not actionable, it's not intelligence. And we specifically inform decisions around prioritizing. How do we improve detection and response? And we break our intelligence consumers into Red Canaries themselves, our customers, and then you all, the broader community, right? With our goal being helping you make better decisions about threats and how to action them. So a little bit how we work. One of our teammates, Jeff Felling, joked a couple years ago that we're all like a little intelligence factory. And so in the middle, that's us, that's our team. And so we have a bunch of different sources, different inputs we use, right? Any threats, events, we've cited in sensors. That's a key source, right? Intrusion analysis is a really valuable source. We track social media. I'm going to call it Twitter. I'm not calling it X. We scrape that. We scrape a bunch of open source resources, blog posts, research from the awesome community. We also have two malware analysts on our team, Tony and Christina, who do malware research. We use a sandbox. And so a lot of you who've done threat analysis, this is not an unfamiliar problem. We have all of these different sources. And before we started using Synapse, we did a lot of manual analysis. I love spreadsheets. Spreadsheets are my favorite. However, I think we can all agree that spreadsheets even have their limitations, right? And so Synapse has really become a key part of our little intelligence factory. As Kyle's going to walk you through today, we've been able to kind of normalize, standardize all of this different data, helps us correlate, and then our goal is actionable outputs, right? We have a bunch of different outputs from our team. You'll see some examples today. We have something called intelligence profiles, which are summaries of different threats. We have intelligence insights, information about threat trends. We produce malware analysis reports for a public, the community audience, you all. We also write blog posts. We do presentations. We do our annual threat detection report. So lots of different outputs. You'll also see today, one of the things that we support, trying to inform better detection. Are there patterns we've seen in threats that we can work with our detection engineering team to try to improve our detection analytics? So lots of inputs, little Intel factory. Now Synapse is at the core of that, and then a lot of actionable outputs that we produce to inform lots of different decisions. So a GIF representation of our little Intel factory before and after Synapse. So before Synapse, we were working hard, a lot of spreadsheets, a lot of copying and pasting. We got the job done, but now after Synapse, there's more chocolate that we can handle, right? We found that Synapse is just super powerful. We keep coming up with new use cases. It's almost overwhelming in its power, but it's really been able to help us supercharge and answer a lot of analytical questions. Any of you who are Intel or threat analysts, we have questions. And here are some examples of analytic questions that would have taken us a really long time to answer before. Now it's a really simple query in Synapse. Scattered spider have been kind of trending in the news lately, right? You might want to know, hey, what domain names has that group used over the past 6 months? Pretty easy Synapse query to do that. Right, another use case we have, maybe someone asks us, hey, have you heard anything about new ransomware? Last month, it was Riceta attacking the healthcare sector. Well, at the time, there's maybe one open source report on Riceta. So one thing we've been able to do is actually, since we're ingesting OSINT, say, alert us if you see any mentions of this ransomware term, right? Just another analytic question. Another question we can now answer, which Kyle's going to be walking you through today. As we see run DLL32, a common living off the land binary execute, we found sometimes different malware families use weird export functions, DLL export functions. And so we can pretty easily query that and look for patterns. So there are tons of analytic questions we can now answer. This is just a couple of examples that have been helpful for our team. I also want to introduce you to our threat groups and our malware families for today. So 2 threat groups we're going to be talking about, TA570 and TA577. And I should note, these are names from the awesome Proofpoint team, who's awesome. They share with the community. They've helped us make sure that we're tracking these group names correctly. And these are 2 groups that you might have heard referred to by these different names. TA570, some researchers will call them presidents, and then 577, sometimes called letters. Now, these names come from the configuration IDs that are in these groups' malware. So, for example, if you analyze malware delivered by TA570, at one point they were using the ID Obama 186, Obama, name of US president. There's Clinton, all kinds of president names, thus presidents, right? Similar idea for TA577, but they'll use letters in their configuration IDs. So, for example, BB14, or there's a TR. We're going to be seeing that today. So just remember, TA577, 572 groups. 577 is the one that uses letters. Now, an important distinction on our team that we found, separating groups from the malware they deliver. We'll talk about why this is so important today, right? TA570 has delivered malware like qbot, iced ID, 577. Actually, just today, I saw a tweet from one of the researchers we'll talk about, Proxy Life, that 577 is delivering iced ID and Darkgate, which has been a recent development. Traditionally, both of these groups have delivered malware that you all might be very familiar with right now, qbot. And you might be saying, like, why are you talking about qbot? There was an awesome takedown a couple weeks ago. Hopefully qbot is dead. Well, please don't leave. This still matters, even though we're going to be using qbot as an example from a couple months ago, right? What we're going to be showing you is how tracking these patterns from the affiliates, from the TAs, into their initial execution of this malware is actually really powerful because, as we've seen just today, TA 577 hasn't gone away because qbot was taken down, right? Now they're just switching it up. They're delivering Darkgate and iced ID. So these affiliates still really matter because they're just delivering different payloads. Here's some example threat components, some telemetry you're going to see today, right? So Kyle's going to be walking you through a campaign from a couple months ago where TA 570 was sending phishing emails with OneNote attachments. You might remember this from earlier in the year. OneNote was the new hotness. That OneNote attachment, right, then executed execution chain. And as I mentioned, run DLL32. That's a common living off the land binary we see to execute malware. You'll see it executed this file, putty.jpg, with this wind export, right? That's a DLL export function, kind of a weird name. And so in this example, what I want to point out is putty.jpg, not an image, that's actually qbot malware. And as I said, right, TA 570, 577, now they're delivering different payloads. So I don't really care, putty.jpg, if I can catch that execution, whether it's qbot, iced ID, Darkgate, that execution pattern still really matters. Last piece I want to talk a little bit about is data modeling. So whenever you use a threat intel system like Synapse, you have to figure out the data we have, how do we map it to the standard model in whatever tool you're using? So one of the things we have, detection analytics, the rules that help us identify badness. And so for that, we create nodes using the meta rule form in Synapse. So if you see meta rule, you'll just see the name of a detection analytic. Whenever we see an instance of a threat, we've seen malware execution, et cetera, we map that and create a node called risk attack with a unique ID, right? With attributes like the date when we saw that sighting. Then we have different components of what we saw in that threat. For example, malicious processes like run DLL32 executing. That's going to have a node type of IT exec proc. And you'll see, right, this kind of nested structure in Synapse, which is nice because for a process, it's under IT exec proc, but then different aspects of execution use that same IT exec form. And then processes do different things. So just a sampling here, they might make network connections to a domain name, an FQDN, or an IP address. So those are the different node types, an overview of them, and Kyle's going to walk through those as well. And then we as analysts, we love context. So these tags on the right add different context. So for example, if it's something that Red Canary has assessed as qbot, we might use the tag RC threat qbot. If it's someone external, right, like researcher proxy life, we might use ext.proxylife.quackbot. So just a little intro to our data modeling. And with that, we're going to do a little screen switcheroo, pass it off to Kyle for a live demo.
Perfect. Thank you, Katie. So before we get into the meat of the demo here, I want to talk a little bit about that data modeling that Katie mentioned. And one place we like to start when we first implemented Synapse was mapping the data sources that we have into the Synapse data model. So the data model explorer here is Synapse's tool for exploring the model, and the elements of the data model that we use for sightings are that risk attack form type, and the key attributes here are properties that we prefer here. Where the time, capturing the time. At Red Canary, we have a lot of different timestamps that we can capture, and the risk attack model helped line up things like when we saw the attack or threat sighting, but also we can capture the interval time of when we first saw it, and then also if it's continuing or has it been responded to, along with things like severity mappings and categories and classifications. From there, we connected this node type to other elements of that sighting, primarily host execution data in our data set today. And that maps up really well in Synapse to the IT exec. And then there's a bunch of different types here. And essentially all of these kind of correlate together to create host execution. So you have things like process executions, your standard file writes and deletes, your library loads, registry activity, et cetera. So this is part of the data model was critical for a lot of the data sources that we use. And it'll work for EDR, telemetry type data, your malware sandbox data. A lot of the power ups will map to this. And then also forensic artifacts would work here from forensics tools. And then connected to this would be your network telemetry or things like from the INET model or INET part of the model. So your DNS records, your FQDNs, your flows. So one of the workflows that our team does is we review these detections or threat sightings, and not all of them. We have automation that helps try and identify, is this tied to qbot? Maybe it's tied to another threat. But sometimes we don't know that. And our detection engineers or other analysts might ask us for input in the moment that they're doing analysis, or we have a process where we review these throughout the week. And so one of the workflows that Synapse has enabled us to do relatively quickly is we can come into a sighting, get an idea of, are there others around the time frame? And in this case, we're going to start with just one. And just from the perspective of a new analyst to Synapse, not using any storm, we can explore into this sighting and see all of the connected nodes to this risk attack node. One place I like to start when I'm doing this or when our team's doing this is to get an idea of what's connected. And so that scroll to form feature allows us to get a quick overview of what other form types are connected or nodes have been connected to this node. One that helps me extensively is just seeing our analytics that fired related to the sighting, get an idea of the picture of the overall activity. So just looking at our analytic names, I get an idea that we're dealing with some OneNote activity, some PowerShell related activity, and then run DLL executing a DLL without like extension. And there's a couple other rules here. And then from there, I can go and look at other elements of this sighting. The cool thing with Synapse is when you have tags and you apply some color rules or tag color rules to your workflow, you can these will be brought to your attention a lot sooner. And one thing that stood out in this particular sighting is this domain is connected. Our team, through our tag rcde.ioc, has determined that this is an IOC. And then also, more interestingly, we have a tag for proxy life calling this qbot. And to point out or to go into that a little bit, proxy life has a GitHub page, and on that GitHub page, throughout, whenever these campaigns or runs happen, they will publish a bunch of like indicators and the execution flow and things like that. And so if we explore into this domain connection, we can scroll down and identify the proxy life posting that we've ingested using a macro in Synapse, for that day. And then this happened to be the recorded artifacts from proxy life published on the 7th of February, the same time as our sighting. So we're relatively within the same time range here. And in Synapse, you can explore into this and see all of the things that we ingested from this particular proxy life document, which are all the like hashes, IPs. We have different servers, URLs, just like every artifact that they've collected. Going back to our attack node here. So that gives us a one point of connection. And that's great. So I'm just kind of leaning towards that pattern. They've documented this being maybe related to a qbot campaign. Going back to that domain, we also see something interesting where we pulled in tweets from that day through the Twitter power up. So that domain was called out in a couple of tweets related to that qbot campaign that day from the BB14 or the TA 577, like Katie mentioned, affiliate group. And we get an idea of the pattern that others are calling out. So we see OneNote, we see some PowerShell activity, we see PowerShell reaching out to that domain to pull down a payload, maybe mentioned in the tweets here. And so I get an idea of what I might want to look for further. And I go look at my sighting data related to the process execution, and I see sorting by time, I can see the same patterns that they were calling out. And so one thing I like to do is, have we seen this in other sightings? So maybe I'll pivot on that payload execution through run-DLL, and I can get to in Synapse, I can get to the unique command line node and see where else we've seen that command line. One thing to note is it's also called out here as qbot in our data set, but also in ProxyLife's data set. So starting to lean more and more towards that decision. Pivoting here, we see all the process executions where this happened. But more interestingly, we actually have used Synapse to extract out the export function names for the run-DLL command lines and executions. So when this node hits Synapse, a trigger would run, extract this out, save it as an IT dev string node. And even further, we've also processed a report from Sophos as well that kind of ties this together a little bit further. So I don't know what that report is. Maybe I haven't read it as an analyst, and I can come in, I can pivot to the article that we pulled that from and open that in Spotlight, which is something I do quite often. And this article, if I scroll to the top here, the overall kind of summary of this article is it was published in late January, early February, before our February 7th activity. It's talking about a qbot campaign using OneNote activity, along with just some other relationships to this late January campaign or run. And if I go to where that string was extracted, we see in this paragraph here, whoever processed this document in Spotlight called out that the DLL payloads dropped to the program data folder, or the root of it, along with, and it launches the function through the export function when, and then they document further activity related to that qbot execution. We don't always see the further on qbot activity depending on the customer environment. Sometimes we do, sometimes we don't. In this sighting, we just execution kind of stopped at this run-DLL execution of the payload. And so from there, we might realize we're definitely onto something here. Pivoting further into that detection. Oops, sorry. If I go back to the attack here, I can use these breadcrumb trails, by the way, to kind of pivot around where I'm at in case I get lost. And so that domain also was connected to 3 other sightings that we had. So what's really helpful with Synapse is I can just quickly explore all of them, kind of get an idea, sorting, I can stack things by command line, path, maybe time, if I care about the time frame of execution. I want to expand this out real quick. And we get an idea that we're looking at some OneNote activity. The file names are different between the different executions and different environments, and that's kind of expected. We see the call out of the PowerShell to the pull down that payload and save it as putty.jpg, and then we see further execution and just lining it all up. So what I'm going to do, what we do at least, is we'll tag them in Synapse, and we'll also associate them in our portal so that customers get that knowledge as well. And we'll use our threat tag for qbot here. And then so from here, what our team will do is either we'll feed some of these patterns and information about an ongoing campaign into notes in Slack or what have you. And we'll use that to either work with our detection engineers to kind of fine tune any detection rules, maybe confirm if any fired or that didn't fire, that should have fired, things like that. And what happened is on the next day, actually, we got 3 more come in, and one of our analysts tied these to qbot. And if we look at these and we kind of stack these so it's a little easier to see, we see that same pattern. The OneNote activity, things change though, like the C2 domain changes, but the URL structure that we're pulling from is similar. And we eventually see that payload execution, and some of these got tied to ProxyLife as well. And so as what our team did with Synapse is we want to capture all of that qbot activity throughout the year, so that maybe an analyst comes in, maybe they're not familiar with qbot or the TA groups, and they just want to get the lay of the land. We have a story that we've built out that shows us like the related threats. We can in real time refresh and get the MITRE attack techniques or the detection rules that are firing on this stuff. We can graph our over time, like we can confirm with the rest of the industry that that drop off in spring happened, and then through the summer. And then what I like to do is this whole like I had this like idea of wanting to track the choices of payload names and export function names and things like that. And so I was like, maybe it's random, maybe wind is just random, maybe it's not very common, maybe there's like 100. So we ran some queries in Synapse, and we actually ended up only having like maybe 10 here over the course of the year, where that name maybe got reused, maybe the choices aren't that random. And so I think it's kind of interesting. Does it tell you it's qbot every time? No, of course not. But it's an interesting choice to track of a threat actor, and it's just it helps us kind of paint a broader picture, along with choices of file names. They like to disguise things as images, maybe, and then we can have more stuff in our story. Other analysts can come in. Some analysts are interested in tracking like the network activity and what port communication or the C2 IPs or what processes are communicating with the different C2 servers and things like that. The story helps us feed our other Intel products. And one of those products that we actually pushed around the timeframe of this campaign was an insight to our customers in our portal. I've pulled it into Synapse here to show side by side with the nodes and the connections here. But essentially, what our team will do, what Katie will do, is they'll write all this up in a format that is digestible for our customers to be implemented into incident response processes and things like that. So this is kind of one of our final products. So Synapse kind of fits itself into that workflow. And with that, I give it back to Katie.
Yeah, and just to jump in here, right, bring it full circle. This is an example that Kyle is showing of an insight that we wrote. Shout out to our teammate Steph who wrote this one. And again, all about having actionable outputs. I think one of the risks of being an analyst is sometimes you get lost in the data and you're like, look at all of our cool DLL export function names. And then you're like, so what? Hey, if that wind export function name is pretty rare, like that could be a detection analytic if we didn't have one already. Or going back to the story, Kyle, if you could for a minute, like this is something that we absolutely track. If you scroll up, we were anticipating like qbot would probably come back late September, October. Thankfully it hasn't, but we are very carefully going to be watching TA577, and we're going to be watching iced ID, right? A separate story for iced ID patterns over months, as well as Darkgate, right? Looking for these same kind of patterns and correlations. So I think that's maybe one of the risks of Synapse. There's so much you can do, so powerful, but I think it's important to always bring it back to what's our actionable output, right? What patterns are we seeing? What decisions can we inform? So that's what we got. I think we have time for questions, Erica, or Ryan, rather. Erica's on the back end.
That was great. We do have quite a few questions from the attendees about the presentation. I'll try to get to some of them, and then I have some that I want to ask just based on what I heard myself during the presentation. One of the questions we did get, Kyle, from the audience was interest in the overhead that it took to get to that point of you being able to I guess, ingest your data into the system, do some of that correlation with some of that proxy life OSINT that you had as well. Can you talk about that?
Yeah, so I can kind of give a short blurb of our, like, I guess, history. So we spent a lot of time on how we were going to model our sources, and I think it helps show that having spent a couple months just really focused in on how we're going to map to the model, what we're going to pull in. We ended up creating a power up to handle all this. So we have unit testing and just like solid engineering practices. And that led to us being able to either use the system in the way I just showed, write storm queries and things like that. So now when Katie comes to me and says, we need to ingest this proxy life data, it's a really good data source, it takes a couple of days to a week or maybe less depending on the source, versus having to run a single, like a data pipeline, an ETL job for everything we need to work with. So we spend a lot of time up front, but now we're able to see the gains in a relatively quick fashion.
Yeah, and just jumping in here, I would say, honestly, if someone's standing up Synapse for the first time, I would say months is probably realistic in a time frame. For us, we were, one of the things I try to look at is like long-term planning. What does our team need long-term? And like spreadsheets working today, but in thinking about, we need to be able to store thread information long-term and correlate that. I think one of the biggest challenges, honestly, was just like analysis paralysis of like, oh no, are we going to choose the right data model and the right nodes for everything? That's where, honestly, the Vertex team was really helpful and kind of working with Kyle. But I think the biggest advice I'd say for someone getting started is just like start somewhere, start with like a use case. Okay, bringing in OSINT data, correlating it with something you have internally. But I think it is important to note that this is a really powerful tool, but it can be complex. And I think months is probably realistic from other folks I've talked to as well who stood up Synapse.
All right. Along with that, we have a question about some custom extractors that you may have written to help you triage OSINT. Would you say that Red Canary has had to do anything to customize your OSINT ingest? Can you talk about that, Kyle or Katie?
Yeah. So in terms of Spotlight extractors, we have a couple that help map to the elements of the data model we use. They're relatively simple. And then we use a lot of the RSS power up and the file parser to do a lot of the bulk lifting of just like easy IOC matching. And then for this proxy life thing, we had to write a macro that like reached out to GitHub and pulled the file in, and then we scraped it that way. But nothing crazy. Like out of the box, you can do a lot with what Vertex provides you, which I think is a key thing. And then what we did and is very helpful is we use the fork and merge workflow to like confirm like we're not going to merge in a bunch of garbage into our production layer.
Okay. So one of the questions that I would ask with that is, what are some of the biggest operational improvements that you've noticed since you've introduced Synapse into your detection and intelligence workflows?
Yeah, I would say just speed, right? Like we could answer these questions most of the time before Synapse, but we couldn't do it efficiently. Like we'd have to copy and paste or like run SQL queries or like search a bunch of different systems. So I think it's really, everyone's favorite single pane of glass. Like we have the data in the same system and we can pull from a lot of different sources. So I think it's just the efficiency. Analysts, as I mentioned, we have all these analytical questions. Like sometimes we actually have to remind ourselves like, hey, I wonder if we've seen changes in this pattern over the past few months. And we're like, wait, we can answer that now. So I think it's the speed and just being able to get answers to our questions pretty quickly, which is pretty fun.
I think the biggest thing is now, with the storm query language and the data model, it's something that our intelligence analysts and our detection engineers and myself included, like are familiar with in terms of the types of data we're working with. And so learning that language is relatively intuitive versus having to every single time someone has a question, like Katie mentioned, having to understand the application database to run a bunch of SQL queries, or depending on the other sources, maybe you have to like pull in stuff from the Twitter API. Like all that can be upfronted in Synapse, and then your analysts can just learn the intuitive data model and the language, and get their answers faster and without having to run data pipelines for themselves.
Sweet. So today, what you demoed for everyone, you gave us insight into how you use Synapse to analyze some qbot endpoint telemetry and refine your detection coverage. Given that we've developed Synapse to represent data from multiple disciplines, and it's pretty extensive in what it can represent, can you share or give the audience a sneak peek into some things that you plan on using Synapse to analyze in the future, or any intelligence requirements that you want to use Synapse to support that you haven't done so far?
Yeah, one thing that I've asked Kyle to work on is ingesting more of our data around SaaS cloud identity sources. And so specifically, one of the things we look at is email telemetry and things like unusual logins, as well as creation of email forwarding rules. So we found kind of starting with the analytic questions is a good way to guide. And so, for example, one question we have is like, what are the most common email forwarding rule names that adversaries use when they're doing malicious things? Again, this is something that like we could run some SQL queries and figure this out sort of, but email telemetry is one thing we want to ingest. And then I'm really excited for getting more telemetry, AWS, Azure, all these other cloud and SaaS sources, because I feel like that's something that as a community, we've just been scraping the surface. So that's one thing I'm excited for in the future.
Agree.
Yeah, I agree with that. I think the cool thing is being able to tie all these different elements of attacks together, like how adversaries use endpoint, the host versus what they're doing in the cloud, being able to tie all that to a sighting or attack together, and then create those start clusters and really see how they operate.
All right. Any lessons learned from your initial Synapse integration?
Yeah, I would say the biggest thing is data model probably 2 or 3 times before you implement. We've had to replay data into our system, and it works well. The system works very well for that. But that it is a time-consuming process to like go and add a huge overhaul to how you're modeling. So really think through your modeling, your tag trees, and things like that. It's doable to fix and change things on the way, but the further in you get, and the more dependent something might be, the harder it will be to change.
Okay. Yeah, I joke. The big thing I recommend is get yourself a Kyle. Or if you don't have a Kyle, the Vertex team is awesome too. They can help. But having someone who's sort of the SME who really understands how the system works, and then they can kind of help everyone else on your team. I am not great at the Storm query language, but one thing we've done, and I've heard other teams this is helpful too, we've created like a useful cheat sheet of common queries. Like, hey, I want to look at all the DLL, export functions for whatever malware tag. So having kind of common queries, that's helpful because then even if you're not great at the query language, you can copy and paste that and just like change it. And then when it doesn't work, just reach out to Kyle or the Vertex team and they'll help you. So I think that's the biggest thing is just not being afraid to dive in. Even if you're not a developer, not a programmer, like you can learn this and, with a few basic queries, like you can actually find a lot. So I think that the fear of a new system is probably the biggest challenge, especially for a lot of traditional Intel analysts.
Cool. Is there anything that you two would like to share that I didn't ask you directly?
Yeah, I got one thing that kind of popped up through that was, if you're an engineer working with a team of analysts and you're working with Synapse, one of the things that I think has helped our team a lot is pay attention to those repetitive workflows and turn those into either Storm actions, triggers, cron jobs, macros, power up commands, what have you, or even the workflow, like custom workflow UIs, because then you're capturing what they do repetitively, and then they don't have to learn the Storm query language at the depth that you might have to.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that Synapse and like our implementation has been a great example of like engineers collaborating with analysts. And I think that's what Synapse is all about, right? You have analysts and engineers on your end too. But analysts bring the questions, the challenges, engineers bring the kind of the solutions, the queries, all the automation. So I would say just those two groups of people on your teams work together, right? We have no lack of analytical questions. And I found that there are very few things that Synapse can't do. It's just a matter of kind of figuring out how to implement it. So it's been a challenge. I'm not going to lie. It's a steep learning curve, but I think that we've been able to kind of answer so many questions and it's been really powerful. So hopefully other people have a great experience too.
That's awesome. I'll be honest that, we put together this webinar to give the community an idea of what it's like to work with Synapse. And as an analyst at Vertex, it's my job to help create the product and advance the product so that it supports analysts to allow you to answer whatever questions you may have of your data and support your business needs. And I can say that working with you too, and being able to hear firsthand how the products helped, Red Canary, it's really been awesome to hear. Red Canary, you're doing amazing things, and I really appreciate the both of you for taking your time to join us today. I respect you both in the industry, and I can't wait to see how else you continue to use Synapse to advance, your company's goals.